Hello class, I hope all of you are still doing well out there, and we want to continue on in regard to our course on civil rights about our analysis of cases dealing with gender discrimination. And again, remember when we're talking about this whole idea of discrimination, understand that what we're saying is, in that context, that public entities cannot discriminate. We're not talking about private discrimination. As we've indicated before, that's different. So for the most part, we're dealing with laws of states, localities, or policies of public entities, whether they're colleges or university, that somehow distinguish based upon gender. And the last time we met, what we did is we looked at a series of cases that pretty much allowed for legal discrimination. Remember that when we're analyzing gender discrimination, there's four different eras. There's this era of legal discrimination, this era of qualified legal discrimination, then finally legal equality, which means equality of opportunity, and then the idea of gender and benign discrimination or affirmative action, which looks more for equality of outcome. So when we talked about our cases last time, we talked about Bradwell versus Illinois, in which Bradwell was barred from practicing law, and the courts upheld that. So clearly that's an example of legal discrimination. And they held it based solely upon gender distinctions without having to rationalize it. Then we talked about Happersett and how she was denied the right to vote based entirely on gender, and that was upheld. And then we talked about Muller versus Oregon and how women were banned from working 10-hour workdays versus men who were allowed to work 10-hour workdays, and how that was upheld simply based upon the notion of gender. Gossert, the female bartender case. Then we talked about Hoyt, who kills her husband and has an all-male jury, and in that state women were not required to serve, and that was upheld. Then the last case we dealt with was Jebb versus Alabama, and in that case it dealt with preemptory challenges. And this is the first case that we deal with where they actually overturn these gender distinctions and says that preemptive challenges cannot be exercised just based upon gender distinctions. So that's where we were, and that kind of marks this new era of our judges and judicial system looking at gender in a little different way and saying, okay, we're going to look at gender distinctions with a jaundiced eye, in a more critical way. We're going to be less accepting of it. But then the question is, what's the appropriate standard to apply to gender distinctions in the law and policy? And when we look at this, the question we're going to ask is, how do you analyze modern gender laws or policies? So the judges can adopt one of three approaches. So the first standard they can have is what's referred to as the rational standard. And for the rational standard, the burden is on the defendant, on the person, in this case, on the woman, who is saying she is being discriminated against. She has to show discrimination. And in order to defeat her claim of discrimination, the state or the public entity only has to show that the objective of that law or policy was a legitimate one that they legitimately could think is beneficial, and that it was somehow rationally related to one of their goals. Now, other approaches to this were intermediate scrutiny, which we didn't talk about because we're going to talk about that today. And for intermediate scrutiny, it's a heightened sense of scrutiny in regard to the law. Do we really need this kind of distinction? So the burden is shifted with this approach to government. Government has to show why this form of discrimination is acceptable and somehow substantially related to a government goal or policy. And then the most exacting standard that some judges apply, and it's a standard that we use for modern cases in regard to race, is strict scrutiny. The burden is on government, and government must show that there's some kind of compelling reason for these gender discrimination approaches and that they are necessary. So as you can see, that's the toughest standard that a public entity would have to satisfy. So now let's actually start looking at some of these more modern cases and how they applied these approaches. So the first case we'll look at is Reed versus Reed, a 1971 case. And this case dealt with an Idaho inheritance statute which uses and applies gender classifications. And what had happened in this case was Richard Reed, who was Sally and Cecil Reed's adopted son, dies intestacy in Ada County, Idaho in 1967. Now what do I mean by dies intestacy? Intestacy simply means you don't have a will. So what happens if someone doesn't have a will? Well, whether you know it or not, if you don't have a will, there are intestacy statutes in every state that says how your property will be distributed. So if you don't want the state to decide these things for you, make sure you have a will. I do have a will. So he dies intestacy. His parents had separated prior to his death. And there's a dispute over who should administer the estate. And the estate was a minimal amount. As a matter of fact, I think the case tells us that the estate was for less than $1,000. So the probate court appoints Cecil Reed as the person to be the executor, per the Idaho administrative law list in regard to intestacy. So according to this list, here's how it worked. The first person who should be allowed to administer the estate would be the spouse. Well, in this case, he didn't have a spouse. The next group of people would be the children. In this case, he didn't have a child. And then the next group would be the parents. And this is where the dispute comes into play. He had two parents who didn't necessarily get along very well. So, what happens when there's two parents who are disputing their right to administer the estate? Well, according to state law in Idaho, it says if competing petitions from a qualified individual of the same priority relationship exists, in other words, they're both parents or they're both spouses, whatever they are, quote, males must be preferred to females. So, when I said when there's competing claims and you have the same status, males clearly have to be preferred over females. So this clearly upsets Sally Reed, and she appeals this decision. So the case goes all the way to the Idaho Supreme Court, and they upheld this male provision for their estate. They said, why? They said, on average, men have higher education and more experience in financial affairs. So they're using this lowest standard here. Is there any rational reason for this? And I say, yeah, there's some reasons for this that can be considered rational. That on average, men have higher education and more experience in financial affairs. And by the way, even if that's true, even if men do have more education and more financial experience, gee, I wonder why. Could it be because there was a whole history of institutional gender discrimination that led to that situation. So what are we going to do? Just continue to reinforce these kinds of biases? Well, clearly she's not happy with that decision, so at that point she appeals to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides this case 7-0. And again, what I'm trying to say is that this case kind of marks this change in approach, philosophy, and emphasis. Berger writes the opinion for the court, and he says, arbitrary preferences that are established in the favor of males violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. He says to treat sexes different. A classification must be reasonable, not arbitrary, and must be based upon some sound ground of difference, which has a fair and substantial relation to the objective of that particular legislation. He says here, when you look at this distinction, it's an arbitrary legislative choice, which by law, by constitutional law, must be forbidden by the Equal Protection Clause. So, in this case, the United States Supreme Court is overturning the holding of the Idaho Supreme Court, which marks a very significant decision. Now, when you listen to the wording, though, of Judge Berger, what you can see is the case uses the rational basis test rather than the strict scrutiny test. So what the justice is basically saying here is there was no legitimate reason here. And again, that's the least exacting standard that you would have to apply on a state or a public entity. So the question would be, what would happen if there seems to be a more rational basis for this? Does any rational reason for a gender-based distinction have to pass constitutional scrutiny? And that becomes the question after Reed versus Reed. And that brings us to this case of Frontiero versus Richardson. And Frontiero versus Richardson was a 1973 Supreme Court case. And the facts of this are pretty interesting. We have an Air Force Lieutenant, Sharon Frontiero. And she claims that the military benefits policy discriminate on the basis of sex. Specifically, she says the husbands of female officers are not eligible for benefits without proof that they're financially dependent upon their spouse. But on the other hand, for male officers, they didn't face the same standard. Their wives were presumed dependent. So they file this in the federal district court, and the federal district court upholds this provision. They said, yeah, this is perfectly fine. So at that point, Sharon appeals this. She said, if I'm an officer and I'm entitled to certain benefits, my husband should be able to benefit from this also. So she appeals it to the United States Supreme Court. And Justice Brennan writes the majority opinion. And here's what he says. He says, classifications based upon gender are inherently suspect and must be subjected to, quote, close judicial scrutiny. Oh, wait a minute. That's not the standard of the rational basis test. This is a different standard. Let's listen to his language again. He said, classifications based upon gender are inherently suspect. Well, if they're inherently suspect, that means the burden's no longer on the defendant. The burden's on government or the state to prove that this distinction is somehow needed and necessary. So it shifts the burden, according to Brennan. And then he says, and it has to be subjected to close judicial scrutiny. So it's not just has to be shown legitimate, it has to be closely examined. Closely examined. And within this context, Brennan writes, our nation has a long history of sex discrimination. Women could not hold offices, bring lawsuits, hold property. Laws were laden with gross stereotypes. What differentiates gender from non-suspect statutes such as intelligence or physical disability? What differentiates them, said, is that sex bears no relation to ability to perform or to contribute to society. Okay. So what we see is he has a very different approach to gender. And he continues on by saying the position of women has improved markedly in recent decades. So this law is constitutionally invalid because it serves no vital interest or purpose. Now, what's interesting in this case is Powell and Blackman concur, but they have a little different approach. They say that not all classifications based upon gender are inherently suspect and would require close judicial scrutiny. So in other words, what we see on the Supreme Court, and this is an 8-1 decision, is that they all agree in this case that Frontiero cannot be denied benefits for her spouse, but they disagree on how to get there. And within that context, as we've said, there are concurring opinions of Powell and Blackman. So we have 4 judges who want to use the rational basis approach, and then we have 4 judges who want to use more of an intermediate standard that looks at women as a suspect class that is subject to higher scrutiny, and it has to be more substantially related, and there has to be more of a burden on government. So what we can see is that gender discrimination analysis is evolving. There's a debate on what's the appropriate approach. And that brings us to a really kind of fascinating case of Craig versus Boren. Craig versus Boren in 1976. This is a 7-2 decision in the United States Supreme Court. And to give you a little background, what's going on in this case is that in 1972, the state of Oklahoma set the legal drinking age for both males and females at 18, and before that it was 21 for males. The one exception, they said, is men could not purchase beer until they were 21, not even what was at that time referred to as 3-2 beer, which is alcohol, low alcohol content. But females could. So females could drink beer, 3-2 beer, at 18, but males could not. So this is a case where males sue the state. And the state's rationale for this was that more males than females are killed and injured in alcohol-related traffic accidents. And there's more arrests of males than females for DUIs. So, based upon their research, they also found that males are more inclined to drink and drive than females. Well, Mark Walker and Curtis Craig take this lawsuit. Walker is the lead party. And they want this case considered under a strict scrutiny test. They said, look, if we're going to say gender is a suspect class, well, that's got to apply to laws that discriminate against men as well as laws that discriminate against women. So this is an interesting case because it's men saying they're being discriminated against because of their gender. So Oklahoma and their district court adopts the rational basis test. They said, well, okay, does the state of Oklahoma have some rational basis for this? And as we just talked about, we talked about the whole idea that they said, yes, the statistics show that men drink more than women, they get more accidents than women. So does Oklahoma have a rational reason to say we should be able to hold men and women to a different standard? Well, using the rational basis test, which again has the lowest level of requirement, Oklahoma concludes that there is substantial evidence supporting differences between male and female drinking, and therefore this Oklahoma law is justified. Well, at that point, Walker and Craig appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. And this case kind of provides a dilemma to some of our Supreme Court justices. Because remember back, we said that there were 4 judges that wanted to have this higher standard. And one of those justices was Brennan. So Brennan has to write the opinion again. So it's very difficult for him to go back on his standard. So what he does, he says, yes, our prior decisions are controlling, our prior decisions in Reed, our prior decision in Frontiero. So the question becomes, he says, does this difference between male and females with respect to 3-2 beer warrants differential ages applied based upon gender? And he concludes, it does not. He says they're clearly trying to be protective of public safety, and that's an important function of the state. However, he says statistics cannot support the conclusion that gender distinctions closely serve this objective of safety. He says even if the statistics are accurate, if it offers only a weak answer to the Equal Protection Clause issue. And the statistics were that according to Oklahoma, what we see is that 18 to 20-year-old males had a much different arrest rate for DUIs. So for example, we found that 2% of all males were arrested for DUIs versus only 0.18%. So statistically, you're much more likely to be arrested as a male than a female for driving under the influence. But even with this difference, they say the numbers are still too small to justify gender discrimination. So Brennan comes to the conclusion that the Oklahoma beer statute invidiously discriminates against 18 to 20-year-old males. Okay. So what you can see is the court is using more exacting standards now. So Craig versus Bourne establishes an elevated level of scrutiny. And it's established this elevated level of scrutiny that's been used in gender discrimination cases ever since. Ever since. All right, so let's look at the next case. Orr versus Orr. This case deals with the constitutionality of the Alabama alimony statute. And it's a 1979 case. And this statute provides that husbands, but not wives, may be required to pay alimony. So it's a case about alimony. It's a case where we have William and Lillian Orr, who filed for divorce. And William is required to pay over $1,200 a month to his wife in alimony. Mr. Orr then argues that the Alabama statute in regard to alimony is unconstitutional because it never requires women to pay. So the Alabama trial court denied that this was unconstitutional. It goes to the Alabama Court of Appeals, and they too sustain the constitutionality of the Alabama statute. So they then appeal it to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court hears the argument. And the argument is that this Alabama law provides different treatment on the basis of gender. And that in order to do that, it must serve some important governmental interest and be substantially related to the achievement of those objectives. Substantially, not legitimately, substantially related to some government objectives. Well, given that standard that the Supreme Court had already adopted in the prior case, as we saw, the United States Supreme Court reverses the holdings of the Alabama courts. And they argue that gender, or the sex of a party, is not a proxy for need. That just as a woman can be in need, a man can be in need. Just as a woman can become dependent on a man can be dependent upon a woman. So these are the kinds of decision that held these laws to be unconstitutional and set a new standard for termination of marriage in the United States. So this is the law, for example. You remember Britney Spears when she got divorced? Well, she was sued for alimony by K-Fed. Remember K-Fed? Well, he was broke, not worth much money. She was worth millions. So he sued for alimony, and according to this new approach, yes, he had need, and she had the means, so she should have to pay alimony to K-Fed. Thank you very much, United States Supreme Court, says K-Fed. So the idea was needy males should be helped along just like needy females. That legislative classification, which distributes benefits and burdens on the basis of gender, can carry an inherent risk of doing nothing but reinforcing gender stereotypes. Thank you.